All right, so again, today we're starting React, but in order to understand React, I'd like to talk a little bit about object-oriented JavaScript. Just going to open up this file I got here. So over the past couple, the last couple of weeks, we spent a lot of time with Python and on Django. And, we've talked a little bit about how Python is an object-oriented language. JavaScript is not an object-oriented language. JavaScript is what's called a functional language. So everything is a function rather than an object. That doesn't mean that JavaScript can't do object orientation, though. And I'll give you a little demonstration here. I'm going to make a class called person. And instead of having a dunder init method, JavaScript uses a method called Constructor. I'm going to have it take a name and a hometown as its arguments. And kind of like how you would say self.name equals name in Python, instead of self, we're going to be using the word this, which is functionally not identical, but almost the same. So you'd say this.name equals name, and this.hometown equals hometown. So constructor is the method that runs when you initialize a new instance of this class. We can also give it methods like say hello, which will just say return, this.name from, never find the $sign on this, this.hometown. Using that, I could say something like, const Noah equals, and I would say new person, Noah from Detroit. And I could run Noah.sayHello. Actually, I'd want a console.log. There we go.
How does it know that say hello is a function? It doesn't, you don't have to put function or anything like that?
Not when it's inside of a class. When it's inside of a class, you don't need to say use the function keyword, because essentially what's actually happening is essentially this is all inside of a larger function. Like class is just a type of function according to JavaScript. So that's object-oriented JavaScript in a nutshell. I'm not going to spend too much time on this just because you don't normally use it very much in vanilla JavaScript, but it's important to see and understand in order to understand React. So what questions do you have about object-oriented JavaScript?
Is a JavaScript class really just syntactic sugar for closure?
I'm not entirely sure if it is. This is I know this implementation of classes is new. I think it's with ES6. It used to be that you would actually say, you wouldn't say class person, you would actually literally say function person and set it up like that. So one of the things they added for ES6 was, syntactic sugar to make object-oriented JavaScript a little simpler and more user-friendly and more similar to real object-oriented languages. But I'm not sure if it's just syntactic sugar for closure or not.
Yeah, I've seen some references on other things, obviously with this, but then there's other. Is there any clarification on how that works?
Wait, sorry, other, did you say?
Yes, other, like, I think I've seen it where you're trying to add something together of a similar class, and I don't know, I was trying to break it down. Like you say, it'd be this dot value plus that other dot value is equal to the result or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not aware of other as a keyword in JavaScript, but yeah, like we could say, have say hello take an argument like greeting, and then just say like so. So you can still take arguments into your things like this, and you don't need to reference the this keyword when you do that, because again, just like self in Python represents this instance of the class. This kind of does the same thing here. Great. What other questions do you have about object-oriented JavaScript? Okay, I'm going to close this out, and I'm going to talk a little bit about React now. I've got a slideshow. So React, it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. And this is an example of a React app. Airbnb, I believe, uses React to develop it. And here are some of the parts that make up React, essentially. So the primary thing you're going to be interacting with are components. So a component lets you split the UI into independent, reusable pieces and allows you to think about each piece in isolation. So essentially, instead of having just a long string of HTML, React allows you to split up everything and kind of essentially allows you to make building blocks that you can assemble in any order you want. So there are two kinds of components. There are class-based components and functional components. So we're going to see both of those today. And components could hold on to data either as state and or as props. And think of props as like an argument that you pass into a function. They can be a component can accept data from its parent component as props. And then state is an object that every component can have access to that stores data that is local to the component. So props is passed down from one component to another. State is only local to that component. And then JSX is essentially what we use to program and like what we actually see. It looks and acts like HTML, but it's actually a syntax extension for JavaScript. So it allows us to write JavaScript in line with HTML like we've been doing in Python Jinja 2 when we were programming in Django. It's kind of the same concept there. So we're kind of pointing out a few examples on this page that are components. So each of these buttons up here would be a component. These buttons here would be a component, and each of these cards can also be in a component. And so component one, again, like once you've created one of them, you can create as many as you need. Same thing with component two and component three. So you only need to program component one once. But once it's programmed, you can reuse it over and over again to make as many buttons as you need, or other things as well. If we can kind of break down a component can also have smaller components inside of it. Kind of like the parent and children thing when we talk about interacting with the DOM. So this example of component 3, this icon can be its own component. This card image is its own component. This text can be its own component, and so can the star rating. And it kind of breaks down into this sort of tree-like formation. So component 3 can pass down props to both card image and card main. And then card image can pass down props to favorite icon, and card main can pass down props to star rating. So, one parent and its children, And props is always passed down from a parent component to its child component. So, this thing is this guided hike. The data would probably originally be put into component 3 by this larger thing, would pass it down as props to one of these cards. And then component 3 would pass that information about that as props to the image, to the favorite icon, all that stuff, saying, okay, here's the image that we want to display, here's the information on it, here's whether or not it's been favorited, stuff like that. And essentially it ends up looking like this. So this is kind of example of what component 3's renders. So we have a div. Inside div, we put in a card image and a card main. Inside card image is another div with a favorite icon. And inside card main is a div with the star rating thing here.
So Noah, that I realize it's probably just being done to illustrate things, but that doesn't seem like a very the data structure there seems a little bit odd. Just it seems like all those things are associated with the entire thing, as opposed to like the icon being associated with the image and the rating only being associated with the verbiage. Seems like they all should be associated with the listing.
Yeah, and these are all just different ways of organizing it. It wouldn't be difficult at all to have component 3 return a card image, a card main, a favorite icon, and a star rating.
Right. Okay, so this is just an illustration of the sort of the nesting.
Yeah, exactly. It can be nested like this. It doesn't have to be.
Okay.
But in general, kind of the React design pattern is typically to try to figure out, okay, in each component, where it kind of organize it by where things are. So it's easier to put the favorite icon inside the card image if favorite icon is a child of the card image.
And when you say put it in the image, you mean physically have it be located there?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. It's probably like a container, and so now it's within that container kind of thing.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So this is kind of just a larger overview of what React looks like. We're going to, kind of get into the nitty-gritty of how that actually works. So don't worry if this isn't making sense yet, because it will. But do you have any questions up for me about kind of this organization pattern before we get into the details? Okay, great. So let's get started. I'm gonna navigate to my React example. I'm gonna make a directory called intro React. Clearing the screen. All right. So whenever we wanted to create a new application in Django, we used Django admin start app, and it would just create everything like this. React also has a generator called create React app, which allows it to configure everything together. It's very, very useful. And you should have all installed npm, Node Package Manager, on day 1. And npm ships free with something called npx, which is an updated version, and we're going to be using that to get started. So I'm going to use npx create React app, and I'll call it my app. It might take a bit. So it's installing React, React DOM, React scripts with something called CRA template. And you're going to have to bear with me. I don't know why my computer always takes a long time to start a React app. It probably will be faster for you, but I'm not sure what's going on with my machine. Well, one thing I can show you while we're doing this is, if you haven't already, there's a browser extension you can get on your browser called React Developer Tools. And it allows you to actually like examine things with greater detail. So I go to Airbnb right now. Yeah, see this little icon just kind of lit up. So React Developer Tools has access to the site. So if I open up my inspector, and go here, I've got components. And that actually allows you to look and see exactly what all the components in a React application are. And you're definitely going to want to use this browser extension both for checking other React applications, but also your own. It makes debugging a lot easier. This has got a lot of stuff in it. I don't know what they do. But yeah. So again, if you don't already, download React Developer Tools for Chrome.
Just Google React DevTools.
Yep. Are you done? Nope. Jeez. You may have noticed it initialized a Git repository, which is helpful. Yeah, I'm going to have to debug this soon. This is getting out of hand. Aha, there we go. Finally got done. So I'm going to cd into my app like it says, and then I'm going to hit npm start like it tells me to do. And when I do, starting the development server, it automatically opens up to localhost 3000. And it's going, it's going. Ah, there we go. You can now view my app in browser, and there it is. This is the default React landing page. It even tells us how to do that, and it gives a link to Learn React. And honestly, after our lecture today, click on this link, go to reactjs.org, because React has some of the best documentation around and some of the best tutorials. So just definitely use it. Open up a new tab so I can actually open up the code. Great, it took me here. So let's take a look at what it actually gives us. Thank you very much. So Node modules essentially holds all of the dependencies locally, so we don't have to rely on our web browser being up and running. So that includes things like Babel, ESLint, Mocha. Public has a bunch of public-facing assets, like this favicon is what it's called. And this thing right here, that all lives in public. So generally, if you're having images there, you may want to put them in the public folder. But SRC, this folder has kind of the meat of what we're working with here. And it's most particularly, it has index.js, which is the file that's first loaded, and it's our entry point for our React app. So breaking this down, first thing we do is we import React from React. We import React DOM. We import our CSS style sheet. We import something called app from ./app. And we import everything from service as service worker. And so right here, import React kind of gives us all the functionality, includes all the code like the markup. And React DOM takes our code and allows it to actually render it to the browser. Importing app is kind of where most of our code is going to start. So let's take a look at app.js. This is kind of our very first React page. This is what's actually displaying here. Even though index.js is what loads it, app.js is what actually creates it.
And is that like a magic name that we always want to use?
App.js?
Yeah.
App.js is the default name. You don't, I suppose you could change it, but by default, kind of your base level is always going to be called app. And it just makes sense to call it that because that always knows, okay, this is kind of the trunk of our tree, as it were.
Okay, thanks.
So we kind of see here, we have a function called app, and that returns something. And this is what, an example of JSX. Or honestly, just looks like HTML, doesn't it? But we've got these brackets here, src equals logo, which we imported up here. And this is an example of what we call a functional component because it's listed as a function rather than a class. So for a while, class components were kind of the main thing, and then functional components were kind of like a accessory to that almost. But in March of last year, the creators of React decided they wanted to start migrating over to primarily functional components instead of class-based components because it makes it a little easier to develop. But they aren't phasing out class-based components. Those are still around. So while new projects will typically use functional components primarily, a lot of old projects, which is the majority of what you'll interact with in real life, a lot of legacy code is still going to be using class-based components. So we're going to be looking at both of them today. So yeah, again, everything inside this return is an example of JSX, which again, this is just HTML with embeddable JavaScript within it. Used to be, and you may still see this from time to time, that a file like this would actually have to be called app.jsx, not app.js. But might as well just call it JS. They just took away the JSX extension because JS works the same way. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our first React app. We're going to create we're going to get rid of most of this code here. And what we're going to do is something pretty simple. We're going to display a button, and we're going to have another display that says how many times we've clicked the button. May sound simple, but tell that to the creators of Cookie Clicker. They cashed out and made it big. So we're going to start by overwriting app.js. So I'm going to keep that return function, and I'm going to keep this div with the class name of app. I'm going to get rid of everything else, though. And if I actually refresh this page, the changes are already there. This is all gone. And first thing you have to know about a React component is that the return value, everything has to be ultimately inside of one div. If we add a second div like this, it'll fail to compile. It'll say parsing error, adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. So having these two divs side by side, it breaks it. Everything needs to be inside of one pair of tags. So this div with the class name app is going to be our container inside of which we put everything else. So I'm going to put an h1 tag. I forgot that it doesn't do the automatic thing like that for me, like with HTML. I'll say I have been clicked X times. And then I'm going to make a button component called click me, like so. So it says right here, I've been clicked X times, and I have a click me function. So this is all just essentially HTML so far, right? But now what we want to do is we actually want to be able to keep track of how many times it's been clicked, right? So again, React components, each of them is capable of holding on to their own information. And the way they do that is by the use of state. And so in order to have our app component use state, we're going to have to change a couple of things. First off, I'm going to change my import React function. And I'm going to put this here. I'm going to use the word use state. Use state is a function that we're going to be able to grab. that allow us to use state. I know it seems pretty simple. Now I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to say const. I'm going to create two variables actually. One called
Well,
count.
why do you need to use curly brackets for the use state import?
Honestly, I feel like that's just always how it's been explained to me. I'm not entirely sure exactly why it's done that way.
Okay, but it doesn't need to go around React.
It doesn't need to go around React. It just needs to go around that use state.
Okay.
Is it using a specific state, like from another component?
Nope, this is going to be its own state. And in kind of this, we're going to use this notation here. So I'm going to create something called count. I'm going to create something called set count. I'm going to set those equal to use state with a default value of 0. And then I'm going to replace this I have been clicked X times. I'm going to use these curly brackets, which are kind of like the curly brackets plus percent signs or double ones from Python. And I'm just going to write count right here, if I can remember how to spell it. So this right here, const count set count, the first thing here is the name of the variable we're saving to state. And set count is going to be the function that allows us to reassign count. And use state, its argument is the default value of count. So what we've said here is count is going to be saved in state starting at 0. And we've created a function called set count, which we haven't really used yet, to reassign that. And right now, you can see right here, it's already updated to say I have been clicked 0 times. And if we inspect it and using the React developer tools, I can see here's my app component. And it also shows me props. It doesn't have any props, and it has state. And inside state, it's got 0 right here, or it's got all right. What questions do you have so far about how this is working?
0 is where you set the default, right? Sorry, I missed it.
Yes, 0 is my default value. So if I set this to 10, count would start at 10.
Thank you.
No problem.
It was interesting to know when you clicked on the inspector there, it just said state 0. It didn't say state count is 0. If you had more variables, would it give you kind of descriptors?
I believe so, yes. And it also displays things from functional components and class-based components differently. So it'll look different. We're going to also implement a class-based component soon, and that'll kind of show that.
Okay. I mean, and it is state is not just limited to tracking one
Yes,
parameter.
you can have multiple things all saved in state.
Okay.
You'd need to define them on different lines. So we'd have like another thing, const, I don't know, fun, set fun equals use state, like so.
There you go. Okay.
But you have to you can't define them all in one line. You need to define them individually.
Gotcha.
Okay, so next I want to be able to make it so that when I click on the button, I want to change the count. Every time I click it, the count should go up by 1. So to handle that, I'm going to make a function. I'm going to make this a arrow function. I'm going to call it const handle click. And all it's going to do, man, I can't type today. All it's going to do is use that set count function that we did that. And I'm going to set it to count plus 1. So set count is literally just a setter. It's shorthand for count equals whatever you put in here. So essentially, every time this function runs, I want the count to be set to count plus 1. And I want this to be this function to be triggered every time I click on the button. So I'm going to go into button. I'm going to say onClick equals handle click. So now, if I click on this, every time I click it, it goes up by 1. If I open my inspector here, again, taking a look at the React components, state keeps on changing, updating automatically. All right, any questions about how this has worked?
What's the structure of line 6 again?
Line 6?
Setting a variable.
Yeah, so this is kind of the variable name, and this is the function that sets the variable whenever we want to update it.
It's called that.
And so every time you want to make a new variable, you just make a new constant square bracket
Yep.
string.
Pretty much.
Yeah, not wasn't const supposed to be something that doesn't change? Or I mean, it's not
Yep.
supposed
I mean,
to. Everything
technically,
can change, but
it can change. It's honestly, if you use const or let here, it's not going to be a big deal either way.
That's a list or an array there. The reference to the array is constant, but the contents of the array has nothing to do with the const itself.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so this is all cool, but kind of the big thing about React is, if possible, we don't want to just put a bunch of stuff in app.js. We want to make a bunch of reusable building blocks so that we can assemble something cool. So I want to make it so that I can have as many buttons and things that keep track of the buttons as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some components. And before I do that, I'm going to kind of set up some folders. And this is kind of the standard way of organizing your code. So I'm going to make a folder called components. Inside that one, I'm going to make another folder called button component. And inside the button component folder, I'm going to make button component.js. So generally, you want to make a components folder, and then every component should have its own folder within it. That's just kind of the standard way of doing it. So I want to get all of this button stuff. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to put it into button component.js. So this one, we're going to turn this button component. We're going to change it into a class-based component, just so you can get a bit of both going on. So instead of importing React and use state from React, I'm going to change this to component. I'm going to get rid of this import logo. We don't need it anymore. We don't need to import from app.css anymore either. Actually, just going to comment all this out for now. So to make a class-based component, the syntax looks like this. Class button component extends component. So it's inheriting from React's component class. So yeah, the word for in JavaScript for class inheritance is extends. Then I'm going to set state. I'm going to make this just an object this time. And it's going to have a count equal to 0. And then we can copy things like handle button, handle click here. We can leave that as is, but we don't need to say const anymore because this is a class-based component. So we can just say handle click equals. And instead of set count, we're going to use a different function called this.setState. Count is going to be this.state.count plus 1. And then we're going to make a function called render. I don't think we need to say this.render. I don't know why it tried to do that automatically.
You're still inside your handler.
Oh, thank you. Here we go, render. And render is going to return some JSX. And then I can just copy that from here. Uncomment it. Like so. Just gonna big stickler for this. And I'm gonna have to change a couple things here. I'm gonna have to change this count to this.state.count. And instead of handle click, it's going to be this.handle click.
It duplicated count on line 18.
Oh, thank you. And then finally down here, we're going to export default button component. So I'm gonna dive into each of these. So again, starting at the top, we import React, and we're importing the component class and library here from React. Button component inherits from the component class. And state is a class level JavaScript object that keeps tracks of different values we need. So we don't need to import useState because state is already kind of built in to class-based components. We set them like so. Then we have this function here, handle click. And you always want these functions to be fat arrow functions because having it as a fat arrow function kind of automatically binds it to the button component class. And this allows us to override the state, and we're going to be using this function setState. And this.setState allows us to override state. So you have your argument is always an object where you set count to whatever whatever you want it to be. In this case, we want to set count to this.state.count plus 1. And within a functional class-based component, setState is the only way you're permitted to change state. You can't use any other function. You have to use the this.state setState function. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
No, Noah, can you go back to the line 4? Can you restate what you said about that that thing? That's a special.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can,
so
yeah,
state,
can you just yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So state is kind of built in to the component class, so we don't need to import useState or anything like that. And when we set state here, we're essentially saying, all right, we're going to create an object called state, which has a key called count with a value of 0 to start with.
So this is kind of like a shorthand for a constructor.
Yeah, in some ways.
This might be jumping ahead, but I have another question.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll ask you afterwards.
Sure. What?
I feel like I might be jumping ahead. But
that's fine.
I'll ask you after.
Okay.
Hey, Noah, could you repeat one more time what you said about the arrow function automatically binding to something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that kind of ties into what this is in any given context. And the thing with fat arrow functions is they don't have their own this. So it essentially, when we create this as a fat arrow function rather than declaring it as function handle click, what we're saying is when we refer to this, we're referring to the button component class. not the function itself. So essentially, whenever you're making functions in React, you should define them this way as fat arrow functions. It's just going to make your life easier. Because otherwise, essentially, you need to use later on, you would have to do something like onClicked equals this.handleClick, and then you need to use something called this.bind to let it know that handleClick is the this in handleClick is referring to the button component, and making it as a fat arrow function just lets you skip all that.
It's been a while since the JavaScript. The fat arrow notation, like basically on line 8, I've written the functions like that, except I usually include like function or const in front.
Yeah.
So you can write it without, and then it's still a valid function, or
you can do that normally, technically in regular JavaScript. You're not supposed to, but within a class, it's the only way. Like you can't even I couldn't, if I do this, it doesn't know what to do anymore. So within the context of a class, you don't use const or let or anything like that to define your functions.
And if you're searching in parallel while Noah's teaching, just watch. You're going to start getting into possibly React hooks and functional based stuff. So don't let that confuse you. Stick with the class-based component like she's doing here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say that, again, we want to familiarize you with both of these. Class-based components are what I kind of grew up learning, but functional components are in many ways quicker and easier because we don't have to say, this.state.count. You can just say count. But there's good reasons to use either one. So I would say, try using a combination of both as you try things out. In any case, the other thing, when you have a class-based component, you always need to have render. Render is the method that actually displays stuff onto the screen. And the return value of render is going to be your actual JSX, which hasn't changed that much from when we did this originally. The difference is that we couldn't just reference count. We had to use this.state.count. And we couldn't just reference handleClick. We need to reference this.handleClick. Otherwise, I wouldn't know what we were talking about. And then at the end, export default button component allows us to export this component so that other places can import it and display it. Any questions about how we created this?
Not a specific creation question, but just a step back and kind of go higher of in what situation is it best to use a function component versus a class component? I mean, are they, in the past, I've kind of interpreted classes to sort of be definitions and functions to be carrying out an operation. Does that extend here?
So in, a few years ago, a class-based component would have more functionality. So it used to be that if you wanted to deal with state, you needed to use a button component. You needed to make it a class-based component. And then if you didn't need state, you wouldn't. You'd make a functional component. But with the introduction of going over here now, use state essentially allows a functional component to have all of the functionality that a class-based component does. So at this point, I wouldn't say that there's any reason to prefer a class-based component over a functional component, which is why the React developers are pushing for functional components to kind of be the only components. But you know, there's a lot of legacy code out there that still uses class-based components. And, you know, you get a job at where you're going to have to interact with React. There's going to be class-based components in there that you're going to know how to be able to, you'll have to know how to use them. So if you wanted to be, you know, more up to date and current with what's going on, you would essentially use functional components all the time. Because essentially there's nothing that a class-based component can do that a functional component can't do. And the reason we're showing you a class-based component now is because, again, you will find them, you will see them. But as you go out into the world, and if, you know, someone says, hey, I need you to make a new component for our app, might as well make it a functional component because it'll do all the same stuff.
And for our work here, you all are fine if we just focus on function-based components.
Yeah, we're fine with that. I don't think at any point we're ever going to mark anyone down for choosing one or the other. Just as you're going through this, know that kind of the React developers say that the best practice is to use functional components.
Okay, thanks.
Steve, I just put a link in chat too that the React docs are really good about. It was a big change for everybody in the React community. So they have a very good section in their docs about comparing the two.
Thanks.
All right, so now that we've created this button component, it's not going to display right now. Like we still have, I'm going to delete all this stuff from our app component right now. I'm just going to get rid of all of this. And nothing's there anymore because all we've got is our app component and nothing else. So now what we need to do is we need to be able to take in our button component and display it here in app. And we do that. I'm just going to get rid of this statement right here and just say import button component from ./components/button component/button component.js. And then to display our button component, all we need to do is just do button component like so. And as we can see, the functionality is the same. And we can see we have our app component, which has a child button component. And yeah, right here, state now actually shows that count is 10 rather than just showing 10. Because class-based, that's how the React developer tools parse the class-based components versus the regular component versus the functional components. I'm not entirely sure why. One thing to keep in mind about state, though, is state doesn't persist. We refresh the page and it goes back to 0 times. And you know, the reason we do it this way is, okay, if we wanted more than one, now we can just copy button component and go, you know, put as many of them as we want. And each of them has their own state, which is completely independent of all the others. Not sure why it's not showing up in my components. Let me go again. Yeah, I'm not sure why components isn't displaying anything right now. That's okay. So that's a ton of buttons, which we've made. It's not really a programmatic way to do that. You know, it's not very dry. So one thing we can do is we can use JavaScript to iterate over a collection of components and put them all on the screen at the same time. So this is what kind of makes React, you know, so powerful at the end of the day. So I can make a function here. So
real quick, just before where you had all the buttons there was nothing special. It's just literally the fact that they were separate components that gave them their own individual state. Each component gets its own state.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. So I can make a function for this component, And when you're when you're inside a functional component, you do need to say const, something. So I'm going to call this create buttons. It's going to equal make this fat arrow function. And I'm just going to say, let buttons is going to equal an empty array. And I'm just going to do a simple for loop. Let I equal 0. I is less than 100. I plus plus. And I'm going to do buttons.push. And inside of each of these, I'm going to push a button component. And then after the loop is finished, I'm going to return that array of buttons. And then down here in my JSX, I can just say, use my brackets here and run create buttons. When I do so, I now have 100 button components, all created programmatically. And each of them, again, has their own state, which is completely independent of all the others. And you may notice I'm getting an error in my console that says, warning, each child in a list should have a unique key prop. This is something React does automatically, because when you do something like this, they want to make sure that everything is unique somehow. So we can just say up here, okay, we create our button components. I'm going to say for each of them, key is going to equal I. So now each of them is going to have a key equal to I, and then we don't get that error anymore.
Should every component we make have a key? Should we give it a key?
Not every single component you make, but anytime you're making more than one component programmatically, like we're doing here, then you should give them a key. So if you're having like a bunch of buttons all together, then yes. But if you only have like one component for like a nav bar, then you don't need a key. All right, what other questions do you have about React?
How do you access that key, like buttons dot key or buttons dot something?
So the way we assign it here is when you add this element right here, we just can say key equals I, and you can add other information to it as well, like class name equals. I think you can just do it as a string, like so. And yeah, we can see here it has a class name of button. So you can do a lot of things that you would normally with HTML. You can do it here as well in JSX.
Right, but how do you access that value of the key? Like could you change the label to be this button 2 has been pressed X times?
Good question. Let's find out. So if I do something like,
This was actually going to be my question for you.
so if I do this dot key, let's see if that works. Uh-oh, I already see an error popping up. Let's check our console. Okay, that's just the logo, not a problem. So if I click on this, all right, it says this dot key is undefined. So if we wanted to access the key, we'd need to figure out some other way to do that.
So are those things you're putting there, like key in that, are those HTML attributes?
Yeah, so those are HTML attributes. And if we actually, look at this, see what actually gets this turned into HTML here. We have a div class app. Inside each div class app, we've got an h1 right here. So kind of got all this stuff going on here that's happening. I also realize that in button component, we already have a class name of app. Let's get rid of that for now, just so we can kind of take a look. Yeah, so we have a div right here. This is our button component. Looks like the class name didn't get put there, so it'd make more sense. I guess it doesn't let you do class name unless you put it here. Oh yeah, because button component doesn't have a class name, it's a component. So this does. So let me do a little research here. Like we want to access React component key. Let's see what happens here. So it says right here, the key property is used by React under the hood and is not exposed to you. So it looks like we're not supposed to be accessing the key. But we could give each of them, we could do something like, this is getting a little ahead of ourselves, but that's all right. I'm going to give it like button ID equals I. And when I do it that way, refresh the page, open up my components here. If it lets me, sometimes it seems to get a little uppity about that sometimes. There we go. So now in props, I've got something here called button ID. And so that's what props is I can pass something down to each of these components. And each of these components now has a button ID. That is the same as the key in this particular case. And if I want to console.log that, I would access that by using this.props.btn ID. That's how I defined it.
So you didn't even have to specify this property on the component itself. You just kind of passed it in and it assigned it automatically for you?
Exactly. So every component automatically has an object called props, which is empty by default. And then you can pass in anything you want as props from its parent component.
But that to pass it in, you don't have to necessarily explicitly pass it like an argument, as we have in other ones, it looks like.
Yeah, and you pass it in, you pass it in here. So key is, again, under the hood by React. But anything else you want to pass in as props, we do so in the same way.
Okay, so you're just pushing it onto the, onto the object.
So, sorry, I don't mean to beat this thing to death. I have one more question. Okay, so if you wanted BTN ID to still exist, but maybe not necessarily pass it in like you're passing it in, you would just then go in and set it inside your state as some kind of default?
Yeah, I could also have BTN ID created in state. But the problem with that is if I have a bunch of these button components, I wouldn't necessarily have a way to make each of these button IDs unique from within this, because each button component is completely independent of all the other button components.
Okay, so I guess from when I was looking at it, when you set the initial state, when you're doing this creation of this button component, that BTN ID that you're passing in wouldn't override the initial state?
No, state and props are two separate things, and we can actually take a look at them here. So we take a look at this guy. So here's props, which has a BTN ID set to 0, and here's state, which has a count set to 4. So these are two separate things. And if you really wanted to, you could do something like, ID is this.props.btn ID. So you could use props to create your state if you wanted to, but you can also just access props directly. So, there's not necessarily an advantage to doing it that way.
Okay, that probably actually answers the question for the thing I'm trying to do. Thanks.
No problem. All right, any other questions about React? Okay, so let's take a look at the challenges for today. We're on week 8, day 1. So we got 3 challenges for today: detention, palindrome, and state abbreviator. So detention is relatively simple. So you've been set to attention, and you have to render 100 times "I will never mutate state or props directly." So this means not doing this.state.count equals 1 or this.state.props equals true. In class-based components, state should only be modified using the React component setState method. In functional components, you should be using useState. So again, that's what this is. So you're going to be creating an app using class-based components in this particular case, and then using functional components as well. And then you'll style it using CSS. And then palindrome. So you're going to create a component that allows users to input a word and acknowledge to them whether or not the word is a palindrome or not. So this is going to be allowing you to use take textbook input in. And particularly, you're going to be using an on-change event listener. So in our button, we have an on-click event listener. On-change is another one, and that one runs anytime the text in the text box is updated. And then you need to capture what you typed, and then you'll need to write a palindrome function. And then you'll need to be able to say, essentially update your components based on whether or not it is or is not a palindrome. I believe we've done palindromes before as more of a algorithmic thing. So if you've done that before, you can go back and get your logic from there. Yeah, way back in week 1, we did this. So you don't need to figure out how to calculate what a palindrome is all over again. You can just use that logic and put it into your React component. Then finally, we have state abbreviator. So continue experimenting with state props and inputs. So this one is going to allow you to get a directory of state data. And you're going to create a drop-down menu that contains a list of US states, and then a component that displays the abbreviation of the selected US state once you've selected it from the drop-down. So this one in particular is going to have you be doing a lot of research on your own as to how to implement some of these things. Drop-down menus in particular, there are many ways to do that in React, so I would suggest Googling it. But honestly, before you do all of this, I would go back and kind of go over, if you didn't follow along with the lecture, go over all of this stuff yourself. So you just get used to the way React handles, because React is one of those things that once you've got the hang of it, it starts to all make sense, but it is a very different way of looking at things in many ways, especially because we have these 2 different ways of creating components. So going back and doing this code yourself is going to be a good way to familiarize yourself with the syntax. And I would also recommend going to reactjs.org and take their tutorial if you're ever feeling lost, because again, their tutorial is extremely robust and can help clarify a few things for you. Any questions?
Hey, Noah, could you go to your functional component, your functional app component?
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out that props only gets automatically populated on class-based components. If you have a functional component that you intend to pass props to, you have to define props in the parentheses there, correct? Like on line 5, you have to say this app is going to be receiving props.
Oh, yes, I believe you're right. Thank you. So yeah, if you're making a functional component, you would need to say props here to so that you can have access to props. You don't need to do that for a class-based component, though. Then you can just say this.props. All right. In that case, take a break. Get some stretch your legs. Look at something that isn't a computer screen for a while, and then you can come back and get started on experimenting with React. Stop the recording.